This was my war. I hated the Germans, I hated the Nazis, and I wanted to do what I could to defeat them.
You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade.
To meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
March 1938, German troops occupied Austria to the great enthusiasm of most Austrians. A few weeks after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, schools had been closed, they reopened. I went to class at the Akademische Gymnasium, which was one of the most prestigious schools in Vienna. All Jewish students were called to the assembly. We were informed that we had been expelled because Jews are no longer entitled to an education. And we were given toothbrushes and water pitchers, and were made to scrub the sidewalk in front of the school, the sidewalk that we had polluted all the time that we had been students there. That was certainly a factor in my parents' decision. There were a number of other anti-Semitic incidents that made it clear to my parents that we couldn't stay in Vienna any longer. My family had been Austrian citizens for many generations, but we decided to leave. My parents decided to leave. I was 13 and a half years old. I didn't participate in any decisions. And we went and took an overnight train to Paris. The only reason we could go is because my father was born in a small village that before World War I was part of Austria, and after World War I turned into Czechoslovakia. So many countries had been carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire so that he could acquire Czech passports for the four of us. And with those we could go to Paris. In May 1940, German troops defeated the British Expeditionary Force and the French army and entered Paris, and we fled together with hundreds of thousands of French people. And we tried to get into Spain, and Spain wouldn't accept our passports because Czechoslovakia by that time had ceased to exist. So we, after 6 weeks on the road where we slept in schools and haystacks, we wound up in Nice. We had applied for an American visa when we arrived in Paris, but we had been told that our quota number would be 5 years in the making. When we were in Nice in the summer of 1940, we checked with the American consulate and found out that our quota number had arrived, even though it was only 2 years. So we were in Nice and we had to get out of France with a French exit visa. We had to go through Spain, who wouldn't recognize our Czech passports. We had to get into Portugal and get a transit visa from Portugal. And we had to get ship tickets from Portugal to New York, which was the only neutral country from where you could still leave Europe. The rest of Europe was all under Nazi control. It was enormously difficult, and it involved all kinds of not necessarily legal efforts. And on the 15th of April 1941, we left Europe 10 days on the ship. And on the 25th of April, I became a citizen of the United States at least in spirit, if not in fact. The moment I touched ground, I was 16 and a half and I had a country again. This was my war. I hated the Germans, I hated the Nazis, and I wanted to do what I could to defeat them. At the same time, I was enamored by the United States. I wanted to show that I am a good citizen. So it was very important to me to get into the war as much as possible and as fast as possible. My parents were not happy that I enlisted on my 18th birthday, because as I found out when I became a parent, the safety of their child is more important than anything else. When I first was called, I spent several days in Fort Dix and sent my civilian clothes back home to my parents and put on a uniform. And from there I was sent to Camp Pickett, Virginia, for training as a medic and basic training. And I spent 3 or 4 weeks in Camp Pickett, Virginia, in basic training, where I remember the most important lesson was anything that moves you have to salute. And during that time I was tested. I took IQ tests and I took language tests. And because I spoke French and German, I suspect, I was sent from there to Camp Ritchie, Maryland, the military intelligence training center. Let me say that I enjoyed my stay in Camp Ritchie, even though it was at times uncomfortable. The training was in interrogation of German prisoners of war, where we practiced. It was in interpretation, military interpretation in French. And above all, it was order of battle, which meant that we were very familiar with German and Italian ranks and insignia of ranks, so that if we got a prisoner of war and could find out what his unit was, from that we could extrapolate the regiment, the army, because we were familiar with the German order of battle. In March of 1944, we went to Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn, spent 4 weeks in Fort Hamilton waiting for a ship, which was extremely crowded. We were 5 men high in hammocks and had to have our barrack bag full of our clothes, our rifle, our helmet, and we constantly had to wear a life preserver. And that ship was in a convoy. Destroyers would surround us, and we landed in Belfast, Northern Ireland. 2 officers of the OSS came around and asked for volunteers who spoke French to jump behind the enemy lines in preparation for the invasion, for D-Day, that we knew was coming, but of course we didn't know when, where, or what. I volunteered. I was sent to London. This was a very secret organization. And from London to an estate, a British estate outside of London, where I was tested, including jumping out of a plane, which I don't want to remember. Finally, some 3 French officers came around and they said, "You speak excellent French, but you've got an accent." I said, "Of course I do." They said, "Then we can't send you into occupied France." So I went back to Northern Ireland, and from there the group from Camp Ritchie that I was with were sent to another camp near Chester, England, and waited there But when I had been dismissed from the OSS, they said they will use you when we can, and they got all my information. When I was in London after that experience, I went to SHAEF headquarters, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, and asked for a G2 officer. And the major came down to talk to me, and I said, I'm highly trained, and I'm sitting in a replacement depot. Can't you use me first? And he got all the information about me and promised he would do something. So while I was in Chester, he had kept his promise, and I was called upon and went back to London, where I served for a period of time at SHAEF headquarters. So I missed out on D-Day. On the other hand, I was subject to the V2 bombs that fell on London, starting shortly after D-Day. First the V1s and then the V2s. And I remember, but when you heard them, there was no defense against them, the first rockets. And when you heard them, sometimes they went gliding, sometimes they dropped straight down. And I remember standing in a store surrounded by glass and hearing the bomb coming. And I said, if they go straight down, all this glass is going to kill me, if nothing else does. And I waited, but it went down in a glide and exploded a couple of blocks away from me. And after the breakout, I should say, from the landing area in August, the need suddenly appeared to be for a French-speaking American soldier, and they found me. The Allied forces had given the honor of liberating their capital to the French, to the Free French Tank Division Leclerc, on the command of General Leclerc. And there were 6 Americans assigned as liaison, and I was one of them. And we entered Paris on the 29th of August. We were among the first Americans to enter Paris together with the Free French. And then I was transferred to the Counterintelligence Corps and spent several weeks in Paris. We occupied the Palais Rothschild, which used to belong to the Rothschild banking family, and then during the occupation had been taken over by the Gestapo and SS. They had an outdoor space, and the Free French, the Force Française de l'Intérieur, the FFI, would arrest people who were suspected of being collaborators, or German soldiers who had put on civilian clothes to get out of the war, and bring them to our Palais Rothschild. And one of my functions was to sort them out and to see whether they should be kept in prison for potential collaboration, or whether they should be let go because they were arrested only because their neighbor didn't like them. You use your judgment. For instance, there was a nightclub owner who owned one of the nightclubs on Place Pigalle. He was an originally a Russian who had escaped from Soviet Russia, and he owned this nightclub. And he was arrested by the FFI and brought to us because obviously, who went to a nightclub? German soldiers. He entertained German soldiers in his nightclub. Did that make him a collaborator or a guy making a living? I let him go. I interviewed a number of German officers, SS and Army. Usually, the Army was much more to be respected. They did their job. But SS, you know what they did. 2 days after liberation of Dachau, I got there. Dachau was not an extermination camp like Auschwitz. Dachau was a labor camp, but people were being starved and killed. Anyway, when I got there were some of the inmates who had died because when our troops came, they gave them food, and they ate too much and too fast because they were starving, and some of them had died because of that. The thing that I remember most about Dachau is the smell. The smell was from the inmates. The smell was from the bodies that were still lying around. I can never forget that smell. For all my life, from the age of 13 and a half until then, I had been impacted by the Nazis. And suddenly it was over, and I would have to come to New York and start a civilian life. I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. But at least I could do whatever I wanted without being afraid of being interfered with because I was born a Jew. When I give my little talks, or gave my little talks, now I'm too weak to do that, I always point out that the SS, as a matter of routine, tattooed their blood group onto their left armpit. And I would tell my listeners, if you go to a beach and you see an old geezer my age with a tattoo under his left armpit, kick him for me.